if your life is going hunky-dory, everything's fine, you got no problems, there's not much in Revelation that's gonna help you. But if you this morning are in pain, or you are looking into your future and what you see are the dark clouds of tribulation and it looks like they're in front of you, John's got something to say to you.
Welcome to Summit Life. You know, we're excited to spend this holiday season with you. This year, we're praying that this month especially is going to bring special joy and meaning to you and your loved ones. You know, unfortunately, for a lot of people, Christmas is actually not a season of joy. Good cheer and glad tidings, even as much as they would love to partake of them, they're a painful reminder of a broken relationship or a long sickness or an empty place around the table. Today, we're going to look to a different spot in the Bible for our Christmas teaching. This is not your normal nativity scene sermon. We're going to draw from John's vision of Jesus in the book of Revelation to uncover not only its beauty, but to encourage us that we need the same vision of Jesus today, especially at a time when the world feels as chaotic as it does right now. Maybe your world feels that way. When God walks us through tribulation, remembering his love and his power is going to help us stop shouting and start worshiping. You know, if this is your first time joining us, I want to welcome you. We've got a website that contains all of our teaching here at Summit Life, as well as word-for-word transcripts that you can study and share with others. These resources are made possible by friends of this ministry, so feel free to enjoy them and use them to grow in your relationship with Jesus. But right now, I want you to sit back, grab your Bible, and I want you to turn to the last book in the Bible for maybe the most unusual Christmas message you've heard, but one that I think will encourage you as we see a vision of Jesus as Lord over all of the chaos in our lives, a message entitled, "The Cradle That Rocked the World."
Get out your Bibles if you have them and open them to the book of Revelation, where we are going to spend the next few weeks in what might be the most unusual Christmas series that you have ever heard. But I assure you, in moments of doubt, it is indeed a Christmas series, and personally, I am very, very excited about it. Most of you, I realize, are not that familiar with the book of Revelation. To you, it probably seems like the Lord of the Rings installment here in the New Testament, and you are not quite sure exactly what to do with it. But I was very familiar growing up with the book of Revelation because the Christian tradition that I grew up in, that was the Christian school that I went to, was pretty obsessed with the book of Revelation because we were really obsessed with the end times. We had our charts and our timelines and with our depictions of the last days, our educated guesses about which political figures and which Hollywood stars were represented by the various beasts in Revelation. We had our annual prophecy conferences. It was the highlight of our church calendar every year. We had our end time movies. We had our rapture board games. None of that is a joke. I personally was particularly obsessed with the rapture, which is the belief that Jesus will come again in the clouds one day, and believers will rise to meet him in the air, after which point Jesus will unleash basically hell on earth for the space of 7 years called the tribulation. And so, as a young boy, 5, 6, 7 years old, if for any reason at all I could not find my parents in the house or they did not respond to me calling out, I would run through the house in a panic, just sure that I would find my mother's clothes neatly in a little pile as she has ascended to be with Jesus, because that's always how it happened in the movies. They always left their clothes behind, which I'm not sure why we thought about. Everybody's going to fly through the atmosphere naked, but that's just how we saw it. Anyway, there was a book. Oh, by the way, I had this recurring dream. I kid you not. I had this recurring dream when I was about that age that the rapture happened. And this is like the worst nightmare I had as a kid. The rapture happened, and Jesus is there, blows a trumpet, and we all begin to ascend up to him, and I get to the top of our house, and then I fall back down to the floor, because that was kind of like just how good of a Christian I was, and to the ceiling and no farther. And so that was the world that I grew up in. There was a book that came out when I was in high school that became an instant bestseller. It was called 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming Back in 1988. Specifically, on September 11th, 12th, and 13th of 1988. It was during the week in the Jewish calendar called Rosh Hashanah. It was put out by a guy named Edgar Wisnett. He was a NASA engineer, and so you had spaceships and scripture. That was a perfect recipe for capturing capturing the attentions of superstitious Christians. This thing sold 2 million copies in the space of just a few weeks. Now, of course, a lot of people pushed back on Edgar Wisnett and said, hey man, the Bible clearly says that no man knows the day or the hour of Jesus' return. And Edgar Wisnett's response was, hey, I don't know the day or the hour, I just know the week. It's going to be September 11th through 13th, but the day or the hour, that's still a mystery. I went to a Christian school, and September 11th through 13th was right at the beginning of soccer season. September 13th, if my memory serves me correctly, was a Tuesday, and so at the end of our soccer practice, our coach pulled us in about 15 minutes early and said, hey, it's September 13th, it's the last day, so we're going to just sit here on the bleachers and we're going to wait and see if Jesus returns. He said, and if he does, J.D., make sure that all the equipment gets back into the gym and locked up and make sure that's taken care of. Well, you should, that's not a joke, that is exactly what he said. Suffice it to say that September 11th through 13th came and went. You would have thought, of course, that would have been the end of Edgar Wisnett's teaching ministry, but the next year he came out with a book claiming he had just done the math wrong. It was entitled 89 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming Back in 1989. I kid you not, I own that copy as well in my library. Now, I realize that you may not have had that experience exactly. Some of you did, but I also know for a fact that some of you still have some Y2K food tucked into a closet somewhere, and I know a bunch of you known every single volume of the Left Behind series, so I know that there are some of you that at least resonate a little bit with what I'm talking about. Personally, I am glad we are not obsessed like that at this church, but I actually think we might fall into an opposite and maybe even more pernicious error. And that is, most Christians in churches like ours rarely, if ever, think about the second coming of Christ at all. But I want you to understand this. The second coming of Christ is the most talked about doctrine in the Bible. The Bible talks about the first coming of Christ a measly 129 times. And we got a whole holiday for that one called Christmas. That's the biggest holiday of the year. Yet the New Testament alone talks about the second coming of Christ 329 times. And we rarely even mention it. For every one prophecy in the Bible concerning Christ's first advent, there are 8 that talk about his second. And really, to even understand his first advent, what we call Christmas, you've got to see it through the lens of his second, which is what the book of Revelation is all about. But I wanted to take the next 4 weeks as we head into Christmas to look at glimpses of Jesus that are given to us in the book of Revelation. Because you see, that is really what the book of Revelation is all about. Who Jesus is and who he is indicates about what the future holds for all of us, okay? In fact, look at the very first verse. You'll see this established in the first verse. John, the Apostle John wrote 5 books in the Bible: Revelation, the Gospel of John, and then 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the 3 letters in the New Testament. So John tells you what he wants to do in this book in the very first verse. This is, he says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. Revelation means unveiling. This is the unveiling of Jesus Christ. But an immediate question comes out of this verse. What is it that is being revealed? What is the revelation of? Is it a revelation of Jesus Christ as if Jesus himself is being revealed? Or is it a revelation that Jesus Christ is doing of something else? Do you understand the question? If I told you this morning we were going to have the presentation of Hank Murphy, does that mean that we are going to present Hank Murphy to you? Or does that mean that Hank Murphy's going to stand up here and present his solar system he made that won the science fair? Because he's still in high school. So is that what I mean? Right? So is it the revelation of Jesus, or is it a revelation by Jesus of these future things? And the answer is yes. The way it is written in Greek, scholars tell us, is deliberately ambiguous because the book of Revelation is both a revelation of Jesus, who he is, that's the most important part, and a revelation of what he sees about the future and what his role is in that future. You see, the main point of Revelation is not to give you a specific timeline of events or to help you figure out which beast is Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. The point is to pull back the curtain of history so that you can see the powers at work behind the politics on earth. People read the book of Revelation with all the dragons and the beasts, and they imagine that it is this delusional fantasy world. But what Revelation is doing is looking at the world through spiritual eyes to show you the powers that are at work behind the powers that you see. It is, in fact, one of the most accurate depictions of the world that you will ever encounter. It is the unveiling. It is the unmasking of what is really going on, where you see the real identities of what is happening out there. It is the unveiling of both the powers at work in the world and the unveiling of Jesus' power above them all. As I was studying it this week, it reminded me of one of my favorite Nicolas Cage movies, Face Off. You're like, is that really your favorite? Yes, next to The Rock, Raising Arizona, Family Man, Con Air, and both national treasures. It is absolutely my favorite. Nicolas Cage, this is a little bit older movie. You may not be familiar with this one. Nicolas Cage works for the government, I think. He's some kind of weapons specialist. And so John Travolta, who's the bad guy, wants to get access to these weapons. So Nicolas Cage has an accident, goes into a coma. And so John Travolta gets the doctor to take off Nicolas Cage's face and put it onto him, right? Because they're about the same size. And so Nicolas Cage wakes up from the coma without a face, which is always a bad day. So he gets the doctor to put John Travolta's face on him. And so throughout the movie, they're going around and everybody thinks that John Travolta's Nicolas Cage and Nicolas Cage is John Travolta. And so the climax of the movie is when they are unveiled, unmasked, and you see which one is actually who. You see who's the bad guy and who is the good guy. Well, what you got in Revelation is the unveiling, the face-off of the New Testament, where you see that the ones that looked like they had power didn't actually have power, and the one you thought had no power actually had all the power. And so the book of Revelation is the face-off of the New Testament. And I realize that I might get my seminary degree revoked for that analogy. I'm fully aware of that. But I've always wanted to be able to say that Jesus was the truer and better Nicolas Cage, and so that's about as close as I can get. All right, you see, the church at this point in history, the church in Revelation is not really doing particularly well. I know you got these glorious images of the early church, and it was awesome, and they were just singing Kumbaya. That is not true. The church is not doing well, especially John, the author of the book of Revelation. All of the other apostles have been martyred by this point, except for John, and John has been exiled on the Isle of Patmos, which is the Roman equivalent of Alcatraz. John had been tortured. Eusebius, the church historian of the 3rd century, said that John had been tortured with one of the Romans' worst torture techniques. They put him into a scalding pot of oil and then slowly heated it up until it came to a boiling point, and right before it killed him, they pulled him out. And they would have done this repeatedly. His skin would have been marred. He wouldn't have even looked like himself. He would have lived in constant pain. Christians were scared all over the empire because Nero had made Christians a scapegoat for a number of Rome's calamities, and then he'd use that as a pretext for hunting them down and killing them. And then one of Nero's successors, Emperor Domitian, was preparing to unleash, John knew, a far worse persecution against Christians unless they would worship Caesar as Lord, which of course they could not do. And so John, from his remote isle in Patmos, John can see these storm clouds of tribulation beginning to build up on the horizon. This was not a great day to be a Christian. And so there, on this lonely, forsaken isle of Patmos, Jesus appears to John in his prison cell. And Jesus gives to John a revelation of who he is and what he is doing in all of this. Now, I realize this weekend that most of us are not facing the same kinds of persecution or any of the kinds of persecution that John and those early Christians were facing. It is not illegal where we live to follow Jesus. Now, of course, I should hasten to add that for some of those listening to our live stream, many of our missionaries are in places where it is illegal to be a Christian. But for most of us, it is not illegal where we live to confess and to follow Jesus. But regardless, we wrestle with many of the same questions that John and those early Christians had. Because many of you face powers at work right now, powers in your life that you believe vastly overwhelm your own. And when you look into the future of your life, you can see storm clouds beginning to rise on the horizon, or maybe you're in one now and you don't see any way out of it. That might come in the form of a chronic illness. Maybe something that you prayed for healing for, and you can't understand why Jesus hasn't given it to you, and it doesn't look like it's going anywhere. Or maybe you're beginning to walk through divorce, or maybe you just concluded a divorce, or maybe it comes in the form of an addiction that you can't shake. Maybe it's a problem with one of your kids, and for the first time, you feel totally helpless. You're like, if I could choose for them, I would, but I can't make these decisions, and I just feel overwhelmed. Or maybe it's just a dark cloud of anxiety or depression that just hovers over your life and seems to follow you wherever you go. And now along comes Christmas, this season, which is supposedly all about happiness and good cheer. But truth be told, you can't stand this season anymore. Because all it does is remind you of the empty place at your table that's not supposed to be empty. Or it reminds you of the broken relationship that you thought was going to last forever that is no more. Maybe you came into this place this weekend and you're just ready to give up. In fact, if you were honest, you're not even sure why you're here. You certainly did not come in this weekend looking for some kind of hope. You're long past good cheer and long past looking for some kind of hope. I need you to understand that as strange as it sounds, John wrote the book of Revelation for you. He was thinking about you when he wrote this book. You know how I know that? Revelation 1:9. Here's what John said. I, John, your brother and companion in suffering. I'm writing this for those of you who, like me, are in the midst of pain and you are suffering, which means if your life is going hunky-dory, everything's fine, you got no problems, there's not much in Revelation that's going to help you. But if you this morning are in pain or you are looking into your future and what you see are the dark clouds of tribulation and it looks like they're in front of you, John's got something to say to you. Here's what it is, verse 10. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. And I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. Those, you're going to find out, represent the churches, the 7 churches that depict all churches in the first century there in Revelation. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like the Son of Man, Jesus, clothed with a long robe with a golden sash around his chest. Those are images that conjure up the high priest of the Old Testament. And what John is saying is that Jesus is the ultimate high priest. He's what everything in the Bible was pointing to. He's our representative before God. Verse 14, the hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze refined in a furnace. His voice was like the roar of many waters. Verse 16, in his right hand he held 7 stars. You're going to find out those represents the leaders of those 7 churches, and Jesus holding them is showing his presence with the church, his control over it. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. We go from symbols that depict the high priest of the Old Testament to these images of ultimate power and control. You see, white hair in those days symbolized wisdom. So saying that Jesus has brilliant white hair like snow means that he is wiser than the wise. Having eyes of fire means that his insight penetrates more deeply than the sharpest laser. Having a face that's brighter than the brightest sun, or a voice that is louder than the loudest ocean, which, communicates not just decibel level, but volume and intensity and fullness, is saying that this is a person whose power just goes beyond anything John can imagine. His words are like a sword, which means they possess the ability to pierce, to separate truth from fiction, to separate into parts, and to destroy. The 7 stars he holds, I told you, in chapter 2, you'll see these are the leaders of the 7 churches, which symbolizes Jesus being in the midst of all the turmoil and holding securely the church in his hands in this hour of tribulation. John says, verse 17, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though I were dead. Now, I want you to keep in mind that this is the first time John has seen Jesus since the ascension. And if you know much about the New Testament, you might know that Jesus and John had been BFFs on earth. Jesus loved all the apostles, of course, but he had 3 that were particularly close to him, Peter, James, and John. And you can make a very compelling argument that of the 3 of those, Peter, James, and John, John was the closest to Jesus. You got a couple of pieces of evidence here. The first one is that whenever John refers to himself in the Gospel of John, one of the other books he wrote, he never refers to himself by name. He always refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, which I always thought took a lot of nerve to actually put into print. Imagine that as his email signature in those first days, like, hey, Jesus likes you guys too, but I'm his favorite. People are like, well, what does that mean? Why does it? Well, here, let me give you serious for a minute, what it actually means. The way it's written in Greek is it's the disciple that Jesus kept on loving. And it's a reference to the statement John made in the Gospel of John that Jesus loved his disciples until the end. And what John is saying is, even after I failed him over and over and over and over again, even after I walked away from him, he kept on loving me, and I am just amazed by that. And so it's a statement about Jesus' grace, not about his being in the favorite position. But that doesn't change the fact that John and Jesus were super close, maybe even more close than the other disciples, because here's the other piece of evidence. John 13, at the Last Supper, John says that he reached back and reclined his head and leaned it on Jesus' chest. Now, y'all, I got some guy friends that I feel pretty close to, okay? But ain't a one of them close enough that they would lean their head back on my chest during dinner. If so, that is a fundamental redefinition of the relationship. There is one young man who would do that, and if he did that, I wouldn't think twice about it, neither would he, and that man is my son. Young man is my son. That's the kind of relationship that John felt with Jesus. It was more than just friend. It was like a child in some ways with his very protective and loving father. Suffice it to say, Jesus and John were close. And y'all, this is the first time that they have seen each other in 60 years. What's that reunion look like? He falls at Jesus' feet as though he had died. And that's not even intended, y'all, to be a figure of speech. He literally thought he was going to die. You know, I grew up with this image of Jesus that came from these pictures that we had up in our Sunday school classroom or our Christian school classroom. Back in those days when I was a kid, there was only like 2 or 3 of these pictures. Like, I think everybody had the same one. You know the one I'm talking about, right? The picture of Jesus looks like an Olin Mills, picture, and it's Jesus with this perfect kind of olive skin, and he's got this beautiful, robe on, and not a blemish on his face anywhere. Nice full lips, got this, kind of Brooke Shields looking, beautiful wavy hair. He's got this expression on his face, like he just saw a bird fly by. You know what I'm talking about, right? This beautiful hair. I mean, it's kind of an image like this, right? Hey, I told you, it's Big Gift Weekend, okay? Big Gift Weekend. That's free for you all. All right, so anyway, I just grew up with this image of Jesus as this like sad, jobless guy who wandered around Israel in his flip-flops, talking about his feelings all the time. Well, y'all, first of all, I don't know where we get that image come from anyway, because Jesus was a carpenter, a table maker, which means as far as guys go, he would have been rugged. He probably would have been pretty buff, but that is definitely not the image that we're getting of Jesus here in the book of Revelation. I mean, what you got a guy, just take it at face value, you got a guy with wild hair. He's got a crazy look in his eye. Just take it at face value, that's not the kind of guy you ever want to run into in a back alley. And then when you understand the symbolism, you realize all this is pointing to somebody so powerful that John in his presence feels like he's gonna die. Now, is this a different Jesus than the one John had known? The one he leaned his head back on during dinner? No, it's just that when Jesus was on earth, and even now in our day, part of Jesus is veiled. Part of Jesus is invisible to the naked eye. Truth be told, Jesus has always had the power that you see demonstrated in Revelation 1. Always had it. It's just that during his ministry on earth and during our day and in John's day, part of that power had been veiled. Every once in a while, it breaks out and you see it. For example, I was thinking this week about one of the quaint little miracles Jesus did that everybody's like, oh, isn't that nice? And let's talk about this in Vacation Bible School. The feeding of the 5,000. Every kid knows about this miracle. It just seems awesome. He shows up. He's got 5 loaves and 2 fish, and everybody gets food, and everybody goes home happy. And we're like, oh, isn't that quaint? Okay, I read an article this week by a scientist who I actually read a few years ago, reread it this week, of a scientist who was talking about how much power it would have taken to create the food to feed the 5,000. Right, because it says that Jesus pretty much created this food out of thin air. He created matter out of thin air. And we know that matter can either be created or destroyed, matter and energy. So, you had to use energy to create the matter. So this guy calculated that if every one of the 5,000 ate 8 ounces of food, which is a pretty conservative estimate, using, Einstein's famous theory that E equals mc squared, he came up with concluded that the amount of energy necessary to create that much matter, to create food to feed the 5,000, would be equivalent, get this, to all the electrical power available on Earth working at 100% output 100% of the time for 4 years straight, just to create the energy necessary to create the matter for that meal. Go back and read John 6. Jesus does it without even breaking a sweat. The point is, the power is always there. You just can't see it. It was veiled. And now, here it is, Revelation 1, unveiled in all of its splendor.